Hello and welcome to the first video in my Python tutorial series. In this video I'll be covering the basic setup necessary for programming in Python, as well as some fundamental concepts such as variables, data types, and I/O. So with that being said, head on over to the Python website to download Python. You would just click this button here that says download Python and then whatever version of Python is currently released. Once you have Python installed, the next thing you'll want to have is a text editor for writing your code in. For this video, I'll be using Visual Studio Code, but you can use whatever text editor you want. If you want to use Visual Studio Code, you would just go to the website here and click Download for Windows. Or if you're running on a Linux or a Mac machine, you would click this drop-down menu here and then click the download button next to whatever operating system it is that you're using. Alright, so now that we have our project directory open, you should see your directory here. It might say something else for you, but for me I call it tutorial 1. Right here you'll see a button that says new file once you hover over it. So click that button and then type tutorial1.py. You can name it whatever you want, but it is very important that you add this .py extension because that is what lets Visual Studio Code know that this is a Python file. Alright, so now that we have our Python file opened, I would like to define a few things before I begin writing the code. So the first thing I'd like to define would be a variable. Now a variable is, by its simplest definition, a name for a location in memory that holds a value of a specific type of data. So let's say I wanted a variable that holds a whole number. Now in computing we always refer to a whole number as an integer or an int data type. So if I want an int data type variable, I would first need a name. So I'm going to call this variable x. You can call this variable whatever you want, but I'm going to call it x. So I would say x is equal to, and now I need some whole number. I'm just going to use the value 10, and there we have it. We have a integer or int data type variable. There's a couple of other data types that we have. Another one would be a floating point or a number that holds a decimal value. So it would be y is equal to 3.2. So this is a floating point, as I mentioned, or often referred to as a float. We also have strings. So a string is just some sequence of characters or just a line of text basically. So, you know, if you in your program you needed to hold like someone's name, you needed a variable that would hold someone's name, that would be a string variable. So let's define a variable called named, and let's assign it to the name Bob, or the string Bob. And this, we know that this is a string because it's denoted by these double quotes. Now in Python you can actually use single quotes to encapsulate strings. There's no differentiation between double quotes and single quotes in Python. It's kind of just up to personal preference. In other programming languages that is not the same, but in Python a string can either be encapsulated with double quotes or single quotes. There's no difference. And the last data type that I'm going to cover would be a Boolean. Now a Boolean is an interesting one because it can only hold two distinct two distinct values, and that would be either true or false. Now in Python, the way you denote these values is with capital letter false or true. But you know, it can't put two here, you have to put one or the other, but just note that you have to capitalize the first letter of each of these values, which would be true or false. So as mentioned, this is a string, this is a Boolean, and yeah, that's pretty much all there really is to say about types at this moment. I mean, we'll run into some interesting things that involve types later on, but as of right now, just note that we have these 4 distinct types. I think there are some more like obscure types that I don't really ever use, but Python, typically all I ever use are these 4 types. like there's some types for like imaginary numbers and that sort of stuff, but it's not really important for the scope of this video. All right, so I have these variables here. This program just assigns a bunch of variables. It doesn't do anything else. So if I ran this code by clicking this play button, we would see no output down here. This program just starts and then it finishes from our terminal's point of view. But let's say I wanted to print, let's say I wanted to display the value of x to this terminal. There is a function defined in Python for that. Now, a function, without going into too much detail here, is simply a name given to a specific chunk of code, basically. So somewhere defined in the Python standard library is a function called print, and the code within that function will print some value to the screen. And how do you print that value? Well, you just pass it to the inside of this parentheses here. So you just literally type x here. If I want to print the value of x, I would just put x there. And if I run this, you can see the value of 10, because x holds the value 10. The value 10 is displayed here. So that's cool. What if I wanted to print the value of x and y? Well, that's pretty simple. All you need to do is you can put as many variables or values into this print statement as you want, as long as they are passed separated by commas. So I can't just put x, y, because Python wouldn't know what that means. So you put x comma y though, and it will recognize that there are two separate variables passed to this function, and therefore it will print both of them separated by a space. So now we can see that we have 10 space 3.2, and it's cool because you can pass different data types. It doesn't matter what you pass here. I could pass all of these variables to this function, and Python would not have any issue with that. So I mean, as long as they're separated by commas. So we have 10, 3.2, Bob, and false in that order. Now, there's something else that I would like to kind of go over here, and that's that Python, like any other programming language, executes its code in a sequential order from top to bottom. So this assignment here is going to always happen before this assignment, and this assignment here is always going to happen before this one, and so on. So it's pretty simple concept. Whatever order you write your code in is the order that the Python interpreter is going to execute your code. So let's say I wanted to reassign the value of x down here. So I would say x is equal to 5 now. And then I print the value of x. What would you expect here? Well, this one comes before this one, and this comes before this print statement. So before this print statement occurs, this is going to happen. So x is going to be reassigned to 5, and then the value of x is now 5, which will be what is printed to the screen. So you can see x was previously assigned to 10, it's assigned to 5, and before the print statement occurs, x is assigned to 5. So 5 is what's printed. So also pretty simple, but also very important to know. So the last thing I'm going to cover in this video will be some simple integer operations. So right now I'm just going to focus on integer arithmetic. So we have adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing. So if I want to add a number to x, let's call another variable z and set it to the result of some addition. So let's say I wanted to add 5 to x. So I'd say x plus 5. Excuse me. So I would add the value 5 to the variable x, which would result in 15. So if I print z, I will see the value 15 printed here. It's pretty expected. So what if I wanted to subtract the value 5 from x? As expected, that results in 5 because 10 minus 5 is 5. Say I wanted to multiply by 5. In Python, you have to denote multiplication with this asterisk. So just keep note of that. It has to be this asterisk. That's 50 because 10 times 5 is 50. And lastly, let's divide by 5. Now here you'll notice something interesting, that when you divide, 10 divided by 5 is obviously 2, but you can see that what's printed here is the value 2.0. And that's because since division is actually a floating point operation, meaning that it's meant to be performed on floating point numbers, because, it makes sense. Division often will result in some decimal value if the number that you're dividing by is not equally divisible by the number you're dividing it from. That'll result in a fractional value. So it makes sense, but since that is the case, we have to first convert the value of x and 5 to floating point numbers, and then divide those, which will result in a floating point number. So don't get too caught up on the details of that. I just kind of wanted to make a little point of that because it has to do with types and it often confuses some people. Alright, so before I wrap up this video, I would like to go over one more thing, and that would be taking input from the user. So let's say we're writing a program that prompts the user for their name and then assigns that name to a variable. So in Python, there's a very convenient function defined for us called input, and what you pass to the argument of this function is the prompt. So what is your name? So whenever I run this program, it's going to print what is your name, and it's going to wait. See, it doesn't finish, it just sits here and waits for us to type something. So I type Bob, and then once I press enter, the program finishes because I got my input and then I didn't do anything with the input, so the program just finishes. So let's say I wanted to assign that to a variable. So this input function does something called return a value, and what that means is it essentially will return whatever the user types. So if the user types the name Bob, that would essentially be the same as replacing that function call with Bob. Or more so, to make it more accurate, it would be the string Bob, because input always returns a string. So the user types the name Bob, name would get assigned to Bob. And I'll show you that now. So it's name. So when I run this, we wait for input. It'll stay here forever until you type something. So I type Bob, and you can see I print the value Bob. And that is essentially really it. I mean, if I wanted to make this more descriptive, because it just immediately prints Bob, I could do something like this. I could say your name is, and then what I have to do here is put a plus here to mash. It's kind of like mashing these two strings together. It's called string concatenation. So with integers, the plus sign meant just adding those numbers together. When you do it with strings, when you use a plus sign with strings, it does a completely different operation. It simply puts the two strings, basically just like squishes them together, and that's what we refer to as string concatenation. So that's useful as well. So when I run this, It says, what is your name? Type Bob. Your name is Bob. All right, and with that, I would like to wrap up this tutorial. If you found it helpful, please leave a like. If you have any questions, leave a comment down below. And with that, I will see you in the next part of this tutorial series. Thanks.